Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Social Impact Track Day 2. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Sydney Hulebach, and I am one of the co-track captains alongside Anshu Biani to plan the Social Impact Track for Techstars Startup Week. And we're really excited to invite you to Achieving Drawdown, Applications for Startups to Tackle Climate Change. Our special guest today is Daniel Rockberg. He is an instructor at the Emory Rollins School of Public Health, as well as the co-founder of the Georgia Climate Project. So Daniel, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Sydney. All right, I am sharing my screen, and Sydney, I'll defer to you and Anshu to let me know if there are any technical glitches with video or audio, but thanks a ton to both of you, Sydney and Anshu, for pulling me into this and giving me an opportunity to speak with the group that we have here today. Really excited to talk about today's topic, Achieving Drawdown and Applications for Startups to Tackle Climate Change. I want to start by quickly defining what is meant by drawdown and then actually introduce a second concept to go with it. So drawdown, for those of you who are following climate solutions discussions actively, will know that there's sort of a new term coined in the past few years of drawdown, which is the point at which the concentration of pollution in the atmosphere starts to come down, not keep going up. And so that is certainly a worthwhile goal for all of us to keep the planet from warming beyond 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So that's drawdown. I actually want to introduce the idea as well of build up, sort of the opposite or inverse of drawdown, which is building resilience to the impacts of a changing climate as well. And as I'll explain later, these are sort of two sides of the same coin when it comes to climate solutions. I want to start, though, by really underscoring a key message that I really hope, if nothing else, you take this away from today's conversation. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you already really intuit this or feel it quite strongly in your bones, but I do not think it's hyperbolic to say at this point that climate change is the biggest risk facing us as a planet and as the people on the planet this century. We are obviously in the middle of a pandemic. We hope very much of all of us that we climb this mountain and get over it. When we do, the climate change mountain will still be there staring us in the face and will actually be even closer than it was before we entered the pandemic. Related to that, though, is I also hope that you all see, and I certainly see, climate change as the biggest opportunity of the century. Not only because if we can tackle this challenge head on and achieve progress at scale and at speed, not only will we minimize the worst impacts, but the process of getting there presents huge opportunities for economic development, for equity, for justice, for any number of other things that we all care about as humans. And so I hope that my guess, anyways, as several of you are in the startup space thinking about new or businesses that haven't even started yet, businesses that are just getting going, or businesses that are up and running, I would really encourage every single one of you to think about how you can weave climate change into your work, whether that is kind of a tangential piece, but still a real piece of your core mission and your core approach, or even better yet, if you can build an entire business model around climate change as the central challenge and the central goal. I'm going to walk through in just a few minutes because I want to have time for questions and answers. I'm going to walk through 4 sections, and you see them on the left here. One is I want to unpack this issue of the risk and what a changing climate means, especially for Georgia, since this is a Georgia-focused conference, and that's where a lot of the work I've been doing of late has been. I then want to talk about the opportunity space, and I'll do it in 2 buckets. One is drawdown or mitigation, and the other one is build up or adaptation. And then finally, I want to close with just some brief thoughts on how you all can get involved if you're interested going forward. So I'll start with the first one. I would guess that several of you think quite a lot about climate change, but just to sort of make sure we're all on the same page, the way I think about what a changing climate means for Georgia and really for the planet boils down very simply to 3 W's. The first one is warmer. The world is getting warmer. I'm actually going to take a step back and explain that in a second. That warming of the planet is making things weirder. It's changing our climatic system in a number of ways in terms of precipitation, in terms of the intensity of our storms. And if you take those 2 together, that makes things worse. So 3 W's, these are not necessarily scientific terms, but I really do think they capture the full scope of what we worry about when we think about a changing climate. I want to start briefly with warmer and come back to this picture here. This is a beautiful picture, but it's also an infographic, which is incredibly sobering. So on the left-hand side, The vertical stripe that is blue is 1850, and on the right-hand side, this is 2018. And each of the vertical stripes represents 1 year. And the color of that stripe represents whether that year is colder or warmer than the average over this period. And as you see, there's a striking and really concerning trend here. As you go to the right, if you add in last year's data, 2019, 19 of the 20 warmest years on record for the planet had been since the year 2000. Georgia's warmest year on record was in that 2019, and three of our 4 warmest years have been in the past 4 years. So there's a real trend here. The planet itself, on average, is 1 degree Celsius, about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average than it was in pre-industrial times. And as I alluded to very briefly, the goal for the planet is to keep that warming from hitting 1.5 or 2 degrees warming on average. We actually don't have very much wiggle room left, actually, given where we are. So I want to unpack this in sort of a little bit more detail to talk about warmer and weirder and worse, especially in the Georgia context. I'm going to do this very quickly. On the warmer side, this is a map of the number of days above 100 degrees in the middle of the last century. So you see by the color coding, Georgia down here, obviously, and less than 10 days a year above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If you fast forward to the end of this century in a scenario where we do not succeed in cutting emissions significantly, the world for Georgia and really the view for the rest of the country changes quite dramatically. So Georgia goes from a situation where we might have had less than 10 days a year above 100 degrees Fahrenheit to one where, depending on what part of the state we're in, we're talking about 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 days a year that are breaking 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Warmer also means that our sea level is rising because we're melting ice and because we're expanding water. And that's playing out in a very real sense on the Georgia coast already. So we're already up about 9 inches now than we were 100 years ago. This is sea level rise vertically, and this is time horizontally. So this is historical data. And what I'm going to show you is projections from the US government in Fort Pulaski, Georgia, the main flood gauge that we have there, out to the end of the century under a range of scenarios. You see that under the lowest of low cases, we're talking about the US government is projecting 1.5 feet of sea level rise on the Georgia coast by the end of the century. Under the highest of high cases, it goes off this y-axis. It goes beyond 10 feet. And right now, the government of Georgia is advising people to think about something closer to this range, somewhere in the 2 to 6 foot range as we plan out to 2100. To put that in perspective, here's a human. She actually lives on Tybee Island, and I estimated her height at about 5-ish feet, and you sort of get a sense of what this looks like in real terms. Actually, I want to pause there for 1 second. Because this is the median sea level that we're talking about, that also means that as tide goes up and down naturally through natural cycles, we have more inundation. Georgia experienced 40 days last year, more than 40 days, where we had flooding on the coast on a sunny day, just because it was a high tide. And that's going to go up to basically near 365 days by the end of the century. Second thing that I want to cover, the last 2 slides were about warmer. I want to talk about weirder. Weirder means, paradoxically, we're projected to see more frequent and intense droughts. This is historical droughts, and you see that Georgia's been hit by a number of major droughts over the past 20 years. 1, 2, 3, 4 big ones, 5 if you count this one. We're projected to see more frequent and more intense droughts in the future. Paradoxically, though, we're also projected to see more frequent and intense heavy rainfall events. So when we do get rain, it's likely to come in more intense downpours, like this flooding event in 2009 at Six Flags outside of Atlanta. I'm going to continue on the weirder part of this. Again, warmer, weirder, and worse to unpack the risks. Also on weirder is that we're going to see more intense hurricanes, most likely. That's the projection. And we know now that these hurricanes do tremendous damage to Georgia's economy and to Georgia's lives and livelihoods. Hurricane Michael, when it came through in 2018, caused over $2.5 billion of losses to Georgia's ag industry. That included major hits to cotton crops, to pecans, to timber, and to vegetables. That was, I think, a devastating, felt like once in a generation event for farmers, especially in Southwest Georgia. If we end up having hurricanes like that, not once in a generation, but a few times in a generation or more, you can imagine how hard it's going to be to rebound and rebuild each time that happens. Another thing we are concerned about is the impact on public health. One of the more concrete examples in Georgia is a projected intensification of our pollen seasons, whether that's going to be longer seasons or more intense pollen counts when we're at our peak, We're actively trying to study that, but the data from around the country suggests that we're likely to see both longer and more intense pollen peaks, with obviously the run-on impacts on allergy. Finally here, or almost finally in Georgia, is the natural systems on which we all depend are also under threat. This is a beautiful salt marsh on the coast of Georgia. You can imagine if sea levels go up the way we've talked about, there are two scenarios. One is these marshes naturally migrate upland in a way that they have for millennia when they've been given the time and the space. Another scenario, of course, is sea level rises fast enough and or they don't have enough room to move that this ecosystem is tremendously transformed, and not for the better, arguably, especially given the vital natural services provided by this ecosystem. These all roll up. When I think about worse, I should say that obviously the ag and the health impacts and ecosystem impacts are in the worst bucket. They also roll up to things like national security. The Department of Defense in 2014, when they did their quadrennial review of threats in national security, they identified climate change as a very significant threat multiplier, which threatens the stability of US national security in the near and the long term. And finally, of course, it's a risk to our bottom line economically. This is a plot of county by county GDP losses projected at the end of this century. Again, in a scenario where we don't succeed in reducing emissions drastically. You see the Southeast is uniquely vulnerable. You see that Georgia is uniquely vulnerable. We might have a small reprieve in the metro Atlanta area on this map, but even that is negative territory for GDP. And throughout the Southeast, there's tremendous vulnerability economically to the impacts of climate change. Okay, I don't want to dwell on that too much. I think you all started this conversation probably with a pretty good awareness of the impacts of climate change. I want to pivot though to where you all fit in, which is what do we do about it? What's the opportunity space? That was the risk. And as I said, there are these major opportunities. In its simplest form, I think it's useful to think about climate change with this very basic conceptual framework. We're obviously worried about the impacts of climate change. Those impacts are driven by the changing climate we talked about, which in turn is driven by greenhouse gas emissions. So if you just stare at this plot, fundamentally right now, we're staring at two different opportunity spaces to make a difference. The first one, of course, is to reduce substantially our emissions of greenhouse gases that are driving climate change. The second is to look on the, so cutting and absorbing emissions. The second is to look on the other side of this framework and think about adapting and building resilience to climate impacts. And I want to pause there for a second because I think this is often overlooked. We're already experiencing the impacts of climate change on a significant scale. And even if we were to turn all of our emissions down to zero tomorrow, which would be amazing for stemming future warming, we've baked enough into the system that we're going to be experiencing unusual impacts of a changing climate for decades to come, no matter what. And of course, the less we are successful at reducing our emissions on the left side of this, the more we're going to have to be dealing with the impacts. So this issue of adapting and building resilience to climate impacts is current, it's real, and it's much more complicated, honestly, than reducing emissions. And I would argue it's a major, major opportunity for anybody who's looking to make a difference in the world right now, is to think about this long game of building resilience to climate impacts. Okay, that said, I'm going to go deeper into the first one first, reducing emissions, this idea of drawdown, and then I'll come back to resilience. This is a plot of global greenhouse gas emissions, the emissions that create climate change. And the y-axis is measured in billions of tons, and this is historical data. And I'm going to show you some projections, and I'm going to show you where we're going with absolutely no policies, where we're going with the policies on the books currently, including through the Paris Agreement, and where we need to go. So the bottom line, of course, is, as you know, we need a net zero planet this century. So that's not a net zero building or organization or company. It's not a net zero city or state. It's the entire planet, which is going to be, what, 10 or 11 billion people by the end of the century on net having zero emissions. It's an incredible lift, and the science is showing us increasingly that that has to happen sooner rather than later. It's not like 2100 is fine. This is where our emissions were projected to go when this group, the Climate Action Tracker, ran projections a couple years ago, kind of in a no policies scenario, just sort of business as usual, nothing new. Emissions skyrocketing to well above 150 billion tons by the end of the century, corresponding to an increase in our global temperature from anywhere from 4.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius, blowing through our goal of 1.5 or 2 degrees from the Paris Agreement. maybe the glass 1/10 full, is that if everybody does what they pledged to do in Paris, and that's a big if, you see the United States actively trying to roll back a number of those policies in the past several years, that might put the planet on track to really bend this curve down to a world where we're seeing warming of 2.4 to 3.1 degrees. Just to be clear, that kind of warming is still incredibly devastating for the planet. Even warming at the level of 1.5 and 2 degrees, which is our target, is already incredibly risky for the planet. So to go above that, every 0.1 degrees even is dangerous. This, unfortunately, is where our emissions need to be on a pathway consistent with a 1.5 degree future or a 2 degree future. This image of bending the curve from where we were going to where we need to go is, to my mind, the central image that I want you all to have in your minds as you think about climate change and making a difference in climate change, because this is the fundamental litmus test of anything any of us does with respect to reducing emissions. If the sum of all of our efforts does not pull our emissions from where they were going all the way down to a path that looks like this, that gets us to net zero well before the end of the century, then we're not doing enough. So how do we do that? There are some really, I think, exciting and new tools that have come on the market really over the past few years. And I want to talk about two of them that are related. One is Drawdown, which is a global effort run by a group called Project Drawdown. It's a great coffee table book. I would encourage you to check it out or buy it if you haven't seen it already. It runs through 100 solutions that these researchers assess will put the planet on path to net zero emissions, and more importantly, to the point where our concentrations in the atmosphere start to draw down. It's an incredibly hopeful book. It's incredibly detailed, and it runs through a number of solutions, many of which are outside of kind of the usual suspects. And that's great. The one complaint I had, several of us had about Drawdown, and they had as well, the authors, is that it's global, it's not local. So in the state of Georgia, we needed a tool that would allow us to figure out what are the top X, in this case, 20 solutions for Georgia that would have the same impact, but do it locally. So some of the solutions in Project Drawdown deal with tropical rainforests. Obviously, that's not a solution that's in play in Georgia. So we had to figure out what was going to be in play in Georgia. So with generous support from the Ray C. Anderson Foundation, they funded a group of us. Georgia Tech was the lead, Emory, University of Georgia, Georgia State, several others were involved to run a process called Drawdown Georgia. And what we did here is we took the 100 solutions from Project Drawdown, and we passed them through a series of filters over the past about 12 months. There are things like, is it relevant in Georgia? Will it be ready at scale by 2030, which is the time frame we wanted to look at? Can it deliver about 1 million tons of annual reduction by 2030? Is it cost competitive with other solutions? Are there pros or cons that relate beyond carbon to equity and economic development and job creation and public health? And we used this filtering process to whittle down the 100 from that book I showed you earlier down to 20 that are relevant for Georgia. This actually just went live less than a month ago. And this is the list. You can go to drawdowngA.org to check it out. I want to pause for a little bit on just the substance that's here. It's really quite exciting because each one of these solutions, and there are 20 on the right-hand side, all those little icons is one solution. Each one of those ballpark gets us at least 1 million tons of reduction in the state of Georgia by 2030 if implemented at a level that the group assessed was fairly achievable. It's not going to happen on its own by any stretch, but it's within reach. And several of these have an upside that's much bigger than 1 million tons if really pushed to scale. The solutions themselves fall into 5 categories. We've got solutions in the electricity sector, solutions relating to buildings and materials, solutions relating to food and agriculture, solutions relating to land sinks, and solutions relating to transportation. If you unpack any one of them, we can take electricity as an example. You see a range of different options going from sort of the classic rooftop solar and large-scale solar to things that play out on the demand side, like demand response, to things that play out especially in industrial facilities and organizations, cogeneration, and then landfill methane as another one. So you've got a whole range of solutions. And I want to flag, because especially in light of your conversation that you're planning to have this afternoon, the food and agriculture line, because there's a bunch of things there that are not part of kind of the usual suspects, including composting, conservation ag, plant-rich diet, and reduced food waste. Those are all things that are very much part of the solution space. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to not touch on this too much, but I want to just give you a preview of some other ideas that are out there, just so you're aware, and then I want to take Q&A. First of all, the group has also taken this solution set and ranked it by economic potential in terms of how much it would cost to implement these. And the point here is several of these are actually net savings. In other words, they are money-making investments, like reducing food waste. Those that cost money don't cost a ton, but they do cost money, and there's going to be a need to mobilize financing for that. But even large-scale solar, as many of you know, obviously can be very profitable in the state. I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time and just quickly flag on the resilient side, it's not as simple as I mentioned. We're building resilience to warmer, weirder, and worse, which means in each of these spaces, there are resilience needs, but also resilience opportunities, whether it's responding to more air pollution, responding to wildfire risk or decreased water availability, or responding to increased sea level or increased heat. There are a number, and very importantly, there's a gigantic equity and justice through line through all of these. I'll just flag a couple of examples just to let you know. AT&T is investing in this on infrastructure resiliency. There's a bunch of folks doing smart irrigation work in Southwest Georgia, which is fantastic. There's a team out of Georgia Tech looking at smart sea level sensors on the coast to make sure we're monitoring sea level rise much more intensely. And I'm going to close just with a few thoughts on how you can get involved. Number one, if you haven't seen it already, please check out georgiaclimateproject.org. This is a network of 9 universities founded by Emory, UGA, and Tech, but it's gotten much bigger, grappling on an ongoing basis with these two questions. What does this mean for us and what do we do about it? And building a network that can help move the state forward on these questions that goes well outside of academia. So please check that out. You can follow the GCP on social or on listserv, et cetera. Related, Drawdown Georgia just got launched. It's its own website. It's a sister of the Georgia Climate Project and its own center of gravity. So drawdownga.org, please go there, check out the solutions. You can sign up there for some crowd solving tools that they have called Group It is one, and then on as well for their listserv. And finally, you should know, many of you might already, that Georgia Tech has a phenomenal program called the Carbon Reduction Challenge. They're also planning to work with their Create X Labs to think about maybe some climate solutions work they can do to sort of incubate some of the ideas coming out of the Carbon Reduction Challenge and or from Georgia Tech students to create climate solutions. And I'm going to close with this thought and then take questions for a few minutes, which is the governor of Washington is now famous for having said that our generation, if you take young and old alike, is the first to really feel the sting of climate change. We're also the last who can do something about it. We can't afford to wait. So I really want to leave with that thought that if your goal in life is to build a business that makes a difference, I can think of no better space to be doing that than in the climate space, whether it's reducing emissions or building resilience to climate impacts. This is an opportunity that's going to be with us for the rest of the century and something that we really have to get out ahead of ASAP. So thanks very much. I'm going to stop sharing and I look forward to taking any questions that y'all have.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And just a reminder, please add any questions you may have for Daniel in the chat. We have one here that asks, is circular economy part of the Georgia Climate Project scope?
I would say that to the extent, there's not a track in the Georgia Climate Project named circular economy. The principles of a circular economy, though, are very much embedded in the work that we're doing and in the work that Drawdown Georgia is doing. And so in that sense, yes, as a formal matter, no, but certainly in spirit, absolutely.
And then for all the startups that might be listening in today who were really moved by your presentation, who realize that climate change is an issue facing not only the world, but Georgia in particular, but feel overwhelmed by the number of ways that they could get started, where would you suggest they start? What's a first step for startups or even established companies who want to start moving in this space in an authentic way? How could they think about getting started?
I would say there are two concrete things. One is to go to drawdowngeorgia.org, drawdownga.org, and spend some time there. One of the things that is on that website, newly launched again a month ago, is for each of those 20 solutions, there are examples of what does a megaton look like? What does a big million-ton reduction by 2030 look like? In rooftop solar, it's 300,000 solar homes by 2030. So that's a North Star that we have to achieve and we have to exceed. For landfill methane, it turns out it's 4 landfill methane plants we assess gets us 1 million tons of reduction from our 120 ceiling. So we got to pull down a lot of tons, but these are things that get us 1 million at a time. I would love to see as many organizations as possible take one or more of those and try to tackle them. Or when you go to that site to look at it, you might come up with something that's cross-cutting in nature, right? Like each of these solutions needs to be pursued on its own in its own lanes, but there's a number of things that are cross-cutting. One of the biggest probably is, how do we mobilize financial investment for any of these solutions, right? There is, as I showed you very briefly, a lot of these are actually good investments. There are things that over time are going to make money for the investor. It would be phenomenal to think about ways to mobilize private investment in these solutions so that they actually, again, start to move forward at scale and at speed. So one suggestion, go to drawdowngeorgia.org. The second one is to really plug into these networks that I flagged very briefly. So drawdownga.org, you can sign up there for the listserv and follow on social. Likewise, the Georgia Climate Project. The whole idea of building this network is it's to create the possibility for conversations like the one we're having today, where folks can find someone else to connect with to move forward on this issue.
Knowing that a big part of the Georgia Climate Project and Drawdown Georgia alike is storytelling and highlighting stories from the field of what innovators and everyday people alike are doing in Georgia to make a difference in mitigating climate change, is there a story that kind of rises to the top that has been inspirational to you in your work, or that's really helped to mobilize individuals across the state to do more?
Really good question. I think there's a lot. I think the story of Georgia on climate change is kind of an untold story of some really important items in our track record and our history, as well as real potential for us to lead and kind of surprise, I think, the world in our doing so. So I'll give you a few. One is Ray Anderson is one example. This is a former industrial leader. He ran a carpet company in Georgia, was, before he passed away in the early part of the last decade, was recognized by Time magazine, I think, as the greenest industrialist on the planet. He basically went through his own, what he called an epiphany, where he realized that what he was doing was making a lot of money and producing a lot of pollution. And he charged his entire company with continuing to do the former and do none of the latter. And by and large has mostly succeeded, to the point where Interface as a carpet company now is working to produce carbon negative tiles. In other words, by the time they finish production of their carpet, they will actually have absorbed carbon from the atmosphere, not emitted on net, which is incredible for a company that's sort of based on producing things often with a lot of fossil fuels as an input. So there's one example in our legacy. Another example in Georgia is in the Bluebird buses, it turns out. Bluebird buses is in Fort Valley. They are making electric school buses, Georgia-grown school buses. They're not selling them in Georgia because we don't have the incentives in Georgia to buy them, but they're selling them in California, where they do have the incentives. So we have businesses in Georgia that are doing very exciting things that are actually at the cutting edge of this sort of climate economy revolution. We also have researchers doing smart irrigation in Southwest Georgia, and a lot of innovation going into that. Everything from the hardware to the software to the analysis of how much water do you put down and where do you put it down and when do you put it down. And I think Georgia is really emerging in a leadership role there. Across, though, each of these solutions that I mentioned, especially in the drawdown space, every single one of them has tremendous opportunity for somebody to look at it in a way that no one else has, or someone to pull together pieces that no one else has. And again, the real challenge that I struggle with is the climate crisis has been with us for decades. For me, it's only been over the past 3 years, despite working on it for 2 decades, that I've really come to terms with the speed with which we need to move, which is really daunting. So.
Another question in the chat from Ed Thomas. He asked, how should entrepreneurs in this space think about the impact of the incoming new administration? Are there parts of the Biden plan that we should be thinking about as business opportunities?
Really good question. Yeah. So bottom line is yes. What the Biden administration has planned is really a microcosm of where the planet is going. So if you sort of take the 4 years as what they have been in terms of, I'm going to park the politics, but simply on climate, even as the US government was pulling out of the Paris Agreement, literally every other country on the planet was still in. And the commitment of every other country on the planet was to get to a net zero planet by the end of the century, which is an unambiguous, massive market signal that says, if you're trying to choose what to invest in, the clean economy of the future is where it's going to be. And there's not going to be a long tail for the sort of legacy economy. Then with respect to Biden, if you look at the top lines of his plans, he's pushing for 100% clean energy in the United States by 2035 and a zero carbon country by 2050. You can unpack that in any number of places, but basically every sector that's mentioned in Drawdown is going to be a business opportunity because these are all going to be moving fast. So there's going to be planetary pressure, political pressure, and perhaps more importantly, market pressure driving these markets forward. And one of the things I feel about strongly in Georgia is Georgia needs to figure out, are we going to position ourselves to be leaders in that clean energy economy of the future, or kind of sit on the sidelines while other people take that mantle?
When building upon that, knowing that really in the past couple of years, cities have really stepped up and mayors have really stepped up to fill some of those gaps at the federal level around climate. How do you see those public-private partnerships working in Georgia? You mentioned, are we going to be a leader? Do you see those conversations happening locally or at the city level within Atlanta?
They really are happening. It's a great question. So City of Atlanta, there are 5 cities in Georgia that have now committed to 100% clean energy by a target date out in the future. So in that sense, you see individual cities very much stepping up. You see in some of the projects I cited, city partners. So the Smart Sea Level Sensors project that Georgia Tech has run is with Chatham County. It's with the city of Savannah. It's deploying these very low cost sea level rise sensors. I think they've got 40 deployed with more on the way, and they're working with the high school shop class to build them and then to run the data on the back end. So there's a sort of great K-12 investment as well. So very innovative technology, policy, and practice that's not only benefiting climate, but also achieving these other goals as well. So I think communities in the state are really shining lights on this issue. And what I have found through the Georgia Climate Project's work is consistently I've been pleasantly surprised by the extent to which people are having the conversation or are absolutely ready to have the conversation if they're given the chance.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for your time and for fielding all of our questions and for your great work in this space. And thank you everyone for joining us for this all too brief conversation with Daniel Rathberg this morning. And as he mentioned earlier, we have a follow-on panel to this conversation, which will be happening at 1 p.m. today, also in the social impact track that's called Zero Waste Solutions for Food Access. So we hope you'll join us for that. And thank you so much again for being a part of this discussion this morning. See you guys later.
Thank you all.